You're welcome to Afrocentric Info. As we move into the 21st century, Africa's relationship with China has emerged as one of the most significant geopolitical developments in the world. With China investing heavily in African infrastructure, lending money to build ports, railways and roads, many are questioning whether the West is growing jealous of this partnership. Western media, quick to label these developments as debt-trap diplomacy or neocolonialism, may be reacting out of fear of losing influence on the African continent, a region they've historically dominated. However, this relationship goes deeper than what's often portrayed in the mainstream. African nations are seeing real progress in development, as China offers investments in infrastructure and industry, without the political strings that often come attached to Western aid. As we dive deeper into this discussion, we'll ask the essential question: is China truly helping Africa, or is this a modern-day version of dependency? China's approach in Africa is nothing like the colonial era of the West. While Europe and the United States have historically engaged in military interventions or imposed harsh political conditions on African nations, China has opted for a more pragmatic, non-interventionist strategy. At the core of this engagement is soft power, the ability to influence through attraction and cooperation rather than coercion. A prime example is Ethiopia. In the early 2000s, China entered Ethiopia to address a need for infrastructural development. They didn't arrive with military force or economic sanctions, but with offers to rebuild Ethiopia's airports, roads and railway systems. The West quickly labeled this as a strategic move to access potential oil resources, yet the reality is more nuanced. China's approach provided tangible long-term benefits to Ethiopia's economy. It was about creating connectivity, boosting trade and enabling local industries, while indirectly securing its own access to raw materials and markets. Western media often points to the concept of debt-trap diplomacy when discussing China's role in Africa, but this narrative isn't as straightforward as it seems. Yes, China has issued significant loans to African countries, over $4.6 billion in 2023 alone. However, these loans typically come with manageable interest rates and repayment plans that are more favorable than those from institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. Western loans often require countries to adopt austerity measures, privatize state assets, and open markets for foreign exploitation. These conditions can weaken social services and government capacity. In contrast, China's loans are usually tied to specific infrastructure projects, and they often allow African governments to maintain greater control over their domestic policies. Moreover, Chinese loans do not impose the same level of political demands, such as requiring adherence to Western-style democracy or economic liberalization. While it is true that some African countries like Zambia, Kenya, and Ethiopia face debt burdens, many African leaders continue to seek Chinese financing because of the tangible infrastructure improvements they get in return. These investments pave the way for long-term economic growth, roads, ports, railways, and airports that increase trade and commerce. It's important to acknowledge that managing debt is a challenge, but it's also essential to dispel the exaggerated notion that China's loans are inherently designed to trap nations into submission. Historically, the West has controlled Africa's economic and political landscape, first through colonialism and later through financial institutions that have often been criticized for their exploitative terms. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, for example, provided loans that frequently required countries to adopt policies that led to social unrest, unemployment, and deeper cycles of debt. Now, with China's involvement in Africa, the West sees its historical grip slipping away. What makes China's engagement different from the Western approach is its focus on infrastructure and trade, rather than imposing governance or ideological models. For decades, African countries received financial aid from the West, but with little to show in terms of lasting development. China, on the other hand, builds roads, railways, and ports, real assets that improve economies and create jobs. This is something the West has failed to deliver. The West's reaction, marked by the debt trap accusations, can be seen as a reflection of their fear of losing geopolitical influence in Africa. Former colonial powers like the UK and France are particularly vocal, and the US has also ramped up its rhetoric against China's presence on the continent. However, this criticism often ignores the fact that African nations have agency in these negotiations. They're not simply pawns in a geopolitical game between superpowers. A key aspect often overlooked in the Western narrative is that African leaders are not passive recipients of Chinese investment. They are active participants, shaping the future of their nations through calculated decisions. Take South Africa, for instance. President Cyril Ramaphosa has made it clear that his country is seeking to narrow its trade deficit with China, striving for more balanced economic relations. Rather than relying on aid, South Africa wants access to China's massive consumer base and opportunities for African goods to enter Chinese markets. This shift is part of a broader strategy across the continent. African leaders want more than just infrastructure. They're pushing for industrialization, job creation, and technology transfer. Countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana are encouraging Chinese firms to invest in manufacturing hubs that can generate jobs and foster economic self-sufficiency. The focus is no longer just on building roads and ports, but on ensuring that African economies can produce goods domestically and become less dependent on foreign imports. The next phase of Africa's development, fueled by its partnership with China, will be driven by industrialization, green energy, and digital innovation. As African economies grow, they are looking beyond infrastructure projects towards sectors that will secure long-term economic stability. African leaders, particularly at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, are calling for investment in local industries. This push for industrialization is a significant departure from Africa's past, where raw materials were exported while finished goods were imported. African countries like South Africa, Nigeria, and Ethiopia are advocating for investments in manufacturing technology and renewable energy, sectors that can create jobs and reduce the continent's dependence on external markets. China, a global leader in renewable energy, has the potential to help Africa develop its green energy sector. From solar power plants in Egypt to hydropower projects in Ethiopia, Africa is positioning itself as a key player in the global shift toward greener technologies. Digital innovation is another area where Africa is looking to China for collaboration. Investments in 5G networks, telecommunications, and e-commerce platforms will be essential for Africa's future economic growth. As China's engagement with Africa deepens, Western nations have been quick to criticize, often using alarmist rhetoric about neocolonialism and debt traps. But a closer look reveals that these criticisms often come from a place of fear of losing influence in a continent they once dominated. The irony is stark. Western countries, particularly former colonial powers, are accusing China of neocolonialism, while their own legacy in Africa is one of exploitation and control. China's model of engagement in Africa is far from perfect. There are legitimate concerns about environmental degradation, labor practices, and the sustainability of certain debt agreements. However, compared to the exploitative practices of the past, where Western loans came with political strings and economic demands, China's approach offers African countries more autonomy and development opportunities. This doesn't mean that African nations won't face challenges ahead, but it does give them a level of sovereignty and negotiation power that they haven't had in decades. As Africa continues to develop, the partnership with China is likely to evolve. African nations are no longer content with being passive participants in global politics. They are increasingly taking control of their own destinies. The FOCAC Summit and China's Belt and Road Initiative represent more than just a transactional relationship. They symbolize a new chapter in Africa's development, where infrastructure, trade, and industry take center stage. The West, accustomed to dictating terms to Africa, will need to adapt to this new reality. China's engagement in Africa may not be without its flaws, but it offers African nations something the West has failed to deliver: real, tangible opportunities for growth and self-sufficiency. The question now is not whether Africa should align with China, but rather how African nations can leverage these partnerships to achieve true independence and prosperity. As the dynamics of global power shift, Africa stands at the crossroads of opportunity. The choices made in the coming years will determine the continent's future. Will Africa and China continue to deepen their ties, creating a new world order that sidelines the West? Or will Western powers find new ways to reassert their influence? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: Africa is no longer the pawn in a game of global chess. It is emerging as a player in its own right. Let us know in the comments what you think about this evolving partnership. Is China truly Africa's ally? Or is it just another player in the game of global influence? Do you believe the West is simply jealous, or do they have valid concerns about Africa's future? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth discussions on the dynamics of global power, Africa's development, and the future of Black culture and civilization. Stay tuned for our next video.